today. First of all, I will, since most of us are in Vancouver, we would like to acknowledge that the majority of us here today are located on the Vancouver area, and therefore we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. So first of all, this section is being recorded and will be uploaded to the IOF. So in case you want to revisit the lecture, or you know someone who wants to see it, there's also that opportunity. If you have a question for our speaker, please enter it in the chat box located on the bottom bar of the Zoom page towards the middle. And once we get to the Q&A portions, Colette and Gabriel will moderate that. So please enter any questions in the chat box during the talk or after the talk. So without further ado, I would like to, it's my honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Boris. I think everyone is really looking forward to your talk, Boris. I heard that we have got one of the most registered participants for today's talk too. So, Boris has his MSc and PhD from the University of Germany before joining Dalhousie in 2004, where he is now a Killam Research Professor in Marine Conservation Biology. I knew I've read Boris' work since I was a graduate student. I mean, he was before two papers about the global impacts of human fishing and human activities on marine diversity and ecosystem services, and that I think have also influenced a lot of my thinking and research in that direction. And I'm sure that's the same for a lot of colleagues and students reading your paper. And since then, in recent years, I have it's really fortunate opportunities to be able to collaborate with Boris in a couple of projects, and all the interaction with him is really inspirational. So I really look forward to your talk today. And I know that since your early works on the human impact, and more recently you have been focusing a lot of thinking about how how people need to deal with those impacts. And I think that there's something title of your talk today, People and the Sea, a Positive Vision for 2050. So I will pass the floor to you, Boris, and thanks very much.
Thank you, William, and thank you everyone for being here and for the invitation to give a seminar. I want to start by introducing you to Nathan. He's the little guy in the middle of this title picture. He's a House of Nation youth from the central coast of British Columbia, so close to where you are today. And he's 4 years old. I think he's 5 this year, and he's learning how to harvest herring spawn on kelp. Product. That's one of the main products that are exported by the House of Nation, and one of the main fisheries they have. And I'm thinking about him these days because he might be a graduate student at UBC, 35 years old in 2050. And I wonder about the ocean that he will see and study and try to understand when he's at that age that you are at now. As I said, I'm trying to provide a bit of a different positive vision for the state of the ocean, despite a lot of the bad news that people at your university and my university have been amassing over the last 25 years or so. And that has created a narrative that is now quite widely distributed among people I talk to, where they feel that the ocean is badly damaged, maybe damaged beyond repair, and that there's not much left there to take. So oceans of nothing, if you will. I think that's a narrative that's only partly true, and it's also one that makes people often despair. So in recent years, I've thought about ways of reframing this as something that we can work on collaboratively, and how we can build on some of the success stories we see in building a better future for all of us, including Nathan, who I introduced you to just a minute ago. So the questions that I'm asking in this talk is, where are we heading from here? More broadly, what's working in our world from an ocean conservation point of view? What's not working, where the main roadblocks and pitfalls are, and what we can do about it. And in this last part, I will talk in a little bit more detail about ocean literacy, which is another part of my research and outreach program that I was told people at UBC are particularly interested in. So I'm spending a bit of time on that. The first part of the talk is based in some part on a recent paper we did, collaborative paper led by Carlos Duarte on rebuilding marine life earlier this year. So let's start with what's working. This is a mangrove plantation that was planted as a restoration project by women in Cambodia and all across Southeast Asia. We find these projects now emerging, where people are restoring mangrove forests as a way to enhance fisheries, to protect coastal communities, and for a variety of other ecosystem services. When we reviewed the state of our oceans in this recent paper, we concluded that a number of pressures in the oceans that were historically at very large, such as hunting of large animals, for example, such as whales or pinnipeds, have peaked and have been decreasing since that peak. Fishing has also likely peaked in many regions, although still increasing in others. Deforestation as a major driver of nutrient input through erosion into the ocean has peaked in many regions. Same for habitat loss, but that the introduction of waste products such as fertilizer runoff, plastic, and other synthetic chemicals, and of course the ultimate waste product, CO2 in the atmosphere and methane that cause anthropogenic climate change, that they are still rapidly increasing and compromising conservation outcomes in the ocean. So as a hypothesis, we said that there was a period where there was sharp increase in pressures on marine life and decline of marine life as a result, something we've been documenting in much detail over the last 25 years, that more recently there's some evidence of slowing down of pressures, at least in some places, and that we could enter a new era of rebuilding marine biodiversity if we choose to do so. And the overall idea here is that we're at a crossroads where this is becoming a real possibility, something that is achievable based on the knowledge we have, and that it just needs to be made a priority that's then implemented not just regionally, but globally. Here's two data sets I would like to share with you. It's very simple data sets that you're probably aware of, but this is a way of showing it, which I think hasn't been done before. This is the increase in protected areas since 1960, and you can maybe keep an eye on the timeline there and mark where you were born and how the world looked like in terms of marine protected areas when you were born, as opposed to now. So we're going through the 1980s now, 1990s, and you see a very rapid, large increase since 2000, and then again more so since 2010 in large and very large protected areas that are now, as we all know, cover about 7 to 8% of the ocean. Now, not all of these areas are well protected. Many of them, in fact, are not. But it's a very fundamental change in how we think about and structure our global seascape. And in a similar vein, since 1960, we have seen a rapid increase, slow at first, but then really catching on in various places around the world, of restoration projects of marine habitats, often coastal habitats such as coral or oyster reefs, kelp, mangrove, salt marsh, and seagrass habitats. So structured habitats that are, again, important for fisheries and important for carbon storage, and with a wide variety of ecosystem services that are now well acknowledged. And you can see the rapid growth in these projects that are local efforts for sure, but in aggregate, thousands of them do make a difference in these coastal habitats, and we do see rapid recovery happening in many but not all of those. So coral reefs particularly seem to be particularly difficult to achieve lasting success. Others, such as mangroves and salt marshes, seem to work out very well on average. But again, the fundamental change in how we relate to our ocean through these restoration projects. Then when we look at marine mammals, we talked about the cessation of hunting of marine mammals with the 1982 moratorium that was then enacted in 1986. So about 35 years or so, marine mammals had time to recover, and we can see that a majority of species now is increasing in green, a minority is decreasing, and a lot of them show stable trends or no statistical change in them. Fish, on the other hand, had a little less time to recover. Fisheries management was reformed in the US in the late 1990s, and then in Europe, in some other places in the 2000s. And you can see again that some fish stocks show increasing trends, but they are not often a majority of cases. Many fish stocks are either stable, often at low level, or decreasing. But when we look at a stock level, we actually do see quite similar trends for those species that have had dedicated recovery efforts. So South Atlantic humpback whales on the right, and Georges band haddock here in New England on the left. Green is biomass, red is catches. Notice a different timeline. The whale timeline starts in 1830 and runs to 2030, so it's projected in the future. The haddock is from 1950 to 2005, but the fundamental dynamics is not dissimilar. You see a large peak of exploitation for humpback whales in the early 20th century, for haddock in the mid 20th century, and then those catches are brought under control, and we see a quite rapid rebuilding after a large protected area was implemented in this particular place. So some hope that that we can turn these things around. We have lots of examples, and we can learn from them. We must not only look at the examples of non-recovery, but also the examples of recovery and what was done right in these places that can be emulated in other regions. We were interested in this paper to look at the timelines for recovery based on the historical record. So we looked at hundreds and hundreds of examples, everything from sponges and corals to whales and birds. And on average, when we do a meta-analysis across these recovery rates, we find about a 20-year timeline for substantial to full recovery for these diverse species groups. As you can see, with lots of variation, deep sea corals would be at the high end, kelps would be at the low end of recovery timelines. But on average, the conclusion was that within a human generation, 20 to 30 years, we can see very substantial, if not full, recovery of these ecosystems. And just some examples that we like to cite, the South Atlantic humpback whale from 400 to almost 40,000 today, northern sea elephants from 30 to about 250,000 today. We looked at the Bikini Atoll that was bombed to bits by 23 atomic bombs that has now higher coral diversity than before the bombing. So we see these really amazing case studies of recovery that teach us something about where we could be if we did the right thing at a global scale. So just a brief recap, what's working here is we do have unprecedented awareness due to all the work at UBC and other places that has alerted people to the state of the oceans and the declining state of many ocean resources. We have commitments through the Convention of Biological Diversity or the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, to turn this around. We have increased conservation and restoration efforts, very rapid increase in the last 10 years, particularly. We have regional improvements in habitat quality and quantity through restoration efforts, but also efforts to bring pollution under control, for example, eutrophication in Europe. We see regional improvements in fisheries management, although these haven't really happened happened in very many countries, but we see positive examples, and we see that based on the recovery rates that we've historically observed, large-scale recovery is in principle achievable within a human generation. So that will be from now to 2050, which should be our goal to when Nathan is a graduate student at UBC, that he studies the ocean that is more abundant, more diverse, healthier, more resilient than what we have now. Unfortunately, when I asked my students in undergrad in my conservation class at the beginning of the class what their vision or their prospect is for 2050, how they see the ocean or nature more generally, they typically anticipate either a similar or worse state than what we have now. A better place in 2050 than what we have now seems unachievable to most people now. And I think that's a myopic vision that's not helpful, and that's not really a world I want to live in, where things just become worse or a little bit less worse if we're really, really good about it. However, there are these roadblocks, and we need to talk about them too. So some things are really not working, and I use the bleached reef here as a particularly poignant example. The Great Barrier Reef, of course, the poster child, bleached 3 times in the last 5 years. Despite good management efforts, despite increased protection over the last decade against the threat of climate change, these protections were largely helpless. So what's not working? Well, what's not working is business as usual fisheries management. And I think we see too much of that in the world, including in Canada. And this is, I think, the most comprehensive study, an update in 2016 that shows that under business as usual, shown here, the majority of stocks will be below their target biomass, and catches will be a fraction of what they are today. And then there's various rebuilding scenarios, rebuilding for maximum catch or maximum profit. If we did that immediately for all stocks, we would have these possible recovery scenarios. And of course, it would also be a lot more profitable than what we have today or what we would have in the future under business as usual. We all know that. Something we're also, of course, paying attention to is that the ocean experiences unabated warming, acidification, deoxygenation, all driven by anthropogenic climate change. What strikes me about these projections here from the IPCC recent special report on the ocean and the cryosphere is the really vast difference. Look at pH, for example, between the business as usual scenario and the mitigation scenario that's on track, or actually even a little bit above the Paris Accord. Stabilization of ocean acidity under the mitigation scenario and free fall under the business as usual scenario. Similar for oxygen, temperature, and also the surface temperature on the planet that affects us, not just ocean creatures. So what I think how this needs to be interpreted is we can still stabilize this and keep it within bounds that are manageable, both to us and to other species. We still have that opportunity today. And of course, with COVID and the associated slowdown, that opportunity has become even more visible, because the rebuilding that will be required could be done on a different energy basis. Something I'm personally really concerned about as a roadblock to rebuilding marine life, even if we do proper management and we reduce fishing pressure, we reduce pollution and so on, climate change still throws a wrench into this because of the effects on ocean stratification, which affects nutrient supply, which affects primary productivity. So this is an empirical trend here published by Fishes and Oceans in their State of the Atlantic Synthesis report, where you see a lot of variability, but an overall declining trend of chlorophyll A in Eastern Canadian waters over the last 20 years or so. And this is a trend we see in many other places, and it has been ongoing for a while, and it's going to accelerate under a business as usual scenario. We can also see already the effect this plankton change has on fish recruitment. So this is a fairly complex analysis. I can't go into all the detail here, but just as a highlight is that we found these deviations from the expected recruitment in fish stocks over the last 20, 30 years, and the best correlate at a large marine ecosystem basis for these changes was the change in chlorophyll levels that we are observing in these places. So the more chlorophyll declined, as we saw in the last slide, the more we saw fish recruitment being compromised for a majority of stocks. And most of them show a decline. Some show an approximately stable trend, and only one LME in this example, the Gulf of Mexico, showed a slight increase in recruitment. So of course, this points towards the decline in the food base for marine life, and that this affects the reproductive capacity of fish stocks. By the way, this is independent of changes in biomass. This is the fundamental capacity of fish stocks to produce young for a given biomass. Of course, we also have the effect of overfishing that's exacerbating any effect the environment has on low recruitment. If there's little biomass to begin with, and the capacity of that biomass to produce recruits is low because of low food supply, that's an added effect that could be quite detrimental. And it probably already is in many places. And when we look into the future, again, here under a business as usual scenario, which I hope, and at this point, hope won't come to pass, and this point, expect won't come to pass, but it's still the track we're on right now, means rapidly increasing temperatures here in black, changes in chlorophyll and changes in biomass. The Arctic Ocean and the Southern Ocean are the only places that see an increase or a stable level of biomass. All other places in terms of chlorophyll and animal biomass, the North Atlantic is the worst example, actually, are projected to decrease up to 1/3 decrease in biomass, animal biomass in aggregate, that is, due to climate change in these ocean basins. Again, this is not due to fishing. Fishing would exacerbate these declines. It's due to the shrinking of the food base that's driven by sea surface warming and increased stratification. So again, we could see a scenario here where overfishing and climate change play hand in hand in very rapidly depleting marine life. And this is not just fish, this is also higher trophic levels. In fact, we found that higher trophic levels such as whales, seabirds, sharks, large fish, and humans show the largest effect here under various emission scenarios. When you look at the relative change from now to the end of the century, you see maybe 5% decline or so in primary production and plankton biomass, and maybe 10 to 15% decline in zooplankton biomass, and maybe 15 to 20% decline with large variation of higher trophic level biomass under business as usual worldwide. So we call this trophic amplification, meaning that the effects of climate change are felt harder and harder at higher and higher levels of the food web, which is a problem because we really care about levels high up in the food web, and we harvest a lot of them. So that wouldn't be so good. So something I really want to, I think this is a very important result that we need to also account for in our fisheries management practices, building in extra safety margin for these kind of effects that are already occurring. Another effect of climate change, not just on biomass, but on this distribution, can also throw a wrench into conservation efforts. Of course, the poster child for that right now, in my view, is the North Atlantic right whale, one of the most endangered marine mammals we have in the world. There were about 350 left when I started to become aware of the stock in the mid-1990s. In the 2000s, they recovered due to dedicated conservation efforts in the areas where they were most abundant in the summer, Rose Bay Basin and Grand Manan Basin in southern Nova Scotia. Most of the world population of remaining right whales was in this area. They had ample food supply. They were protected by critical habitat zones, rerouting of shipping lanes, rearrangement of fishing effort, so they could be kept safe. Mortality was low, birth rates were high because food was good, and the species increased from 350 to about 450 individuals in about 10 years. All of this reversed after 2010 when whales started to experienced a collapse in food supply in the Gulf of Maine due to rapid warming. They then redistributed into a new habitat in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and this caused what's called an unusual mortality event in these animals. These are only the ones we know about that were killed by either ships or fishing gear. Largely in this new habitat here, the red bars for Canada. Again, a good news story this year, we only had one death in the US, none in Canada, due to very stringent conservation measures that dynamically adapted to the changes in the distribution of this animal. So it's a good news, bad news story, mostly a bad news story, because the species is back down according to the news results to 350 individuals. All of the conservation gains in the early 2000s have been erased by this recent event, driven both by climate change and then by interactions with fishing and shipping that were not recognized quickly enough, and lots of whales had to die before dynamic management measures could be implemented that were effective in protecting this highly endangered species. So again, we can see how climate change, fishing, and conservation efforts here interact in a way that can be really dangerous for these species that are already at low abundance. Of course, protected areas can help with this. They can save whales, they can save fish, they can save marine habitats. There's lots of mechanisms by which they can also build climate resilience. For example, by building up functional food webs, by providing stepping stones for dispersal, by amassing food resources, by reducing other human stressors, so climate change is not acting synergistically with other human stressors and so on. They also have benefits for carbon storage and other ecosystem services such as tourism. So clearly, green protected areas are part of the solution. We all know this. However, in order to do this effectively, they need to be not just designated, they need to be actually protected. We took a critical look at this in Europe, Northern Europe. The European Union has about 720 marine protected areas in the North and Baltic Seas and around Great Britain, France, and Spain. We didn't look at the Mediterranean, but since then the same result has been confirmed for the Mediterranean, that in fact, fishing effort inside the protected areas, on average, is larger than it is outside, particularly for trawling, which of course is one of the more destructive forms of fishing that will impact bottom habitats. And because of that, most likely we see inside the protected area a lower abundance, quite a bit lower abundance of sensitive indicator species. In this case, we picked ground sharks and rays, vulnerable elasmobranchs that are very sensitive to trawling. And we see that this increased fishing pressure inside the protected areas does result in a lower abundance of these indicator species inside the protected areas. So this is a conservation paradox that is due to insufficient protection standards in these protected areas, so-called protected areas, that actually attract rather than repel fishing pressure. So a few things that are not working, unfortunately. We're still lacking truly global fisheries solutions where we see coordinations among countries to rebuild fish stocks. We see rising emissions and rising effects of climate change. We see, unfortunately, slow governance responses to some of these changes. Cumulative impacts are probably at an all-time high. If we take everything together that's happening in the ocean, the cumulative impact on marine life is probably not diminishing at this point, at least in most areas. Then we see many poorly protected areas, which I've misnomed PUPAs here, because it's really something that we have to grapple with, is that we may feel good about increasing protected area coverage, and we should, but we have to very critically look at the management and enforcement of these areas and whether they actually do what they promise to do, because they certainly can when they're well protected. There's lots of examples of that too. So that brings me to the concluding part of this talk. What can we possibly do about this? Some things are working, some things are not working so well. And this is something actually I really only saw through last week. So when I read this paper, which came out in Nature last week, I think it was published online a couple of weeks earlier, but it was in the last edition of Nature last week, Global Priorities Areas for Ecosystem Restoration. And this is a conservation planning exercise where essentially we see a twinning or combining of the agendas for biodiversity protection and for climate change mitigations through nature-based solutions. So what the authors did on land here, that they looked at the optimal network of restoration sites that would enable both co-benefits for biodiversity restoration and for the locking up of carbon in the biosphere that would mitigate climate change. And I think their headline was that about 50% increase, 15.15 increase in restoration. So 15% of degraded lands were protected, and we choose the right lands that have a large capacity to rebuild biodiversity and store carbon. We could mitigate about 1/3 of global cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution, which seems amazing. And I was at first a little suspicious about this until I saw this paper, which came out the same week in the same issue of Nature, which showed that this is already happening in a place that I wouldn't have suspected this to happen, which is southern China. A new network of CO2 sensors showed a large net sink for carbon in southern China that coincides with large reforestation efforts in this region, very large scale efforts. And you can see from satellites the increased greenness and vegetation index in this area. So that's well documented in this paper. But at the same time, a large carbon sink appears that actually accounts, according to the study, for roughly half, 45% of annual emissions in carbon dioxide of this nation, China, which of course is responsible for about, I think, 1/4 or 1/3, I can't quite remember, of global emissions, 27% of global emissions in CO2. So these nature-based solutions can work, and they can work at scale if they're implemented at scale. Coincidentally, William and I and others were involved in a global exercise to do just that for the ocean. You recognize it in the Strasbourg article, the ocean was not considered. So we looked at this for the ocean, and we looked at 3 co-benefits actually: biodiversity, carbon, and food. Because protection in the right places of the ocean, particularly those that are degraded and overfished and have poor management, can result in large food benefits through rebuilding of previously depleted stocks that can then be fished and harvested outside of these protected areas through spillover effects. So this was modeled at a global scale. This is a paper in revision. I can't show too many details, but the upshot is, like on land, we can see these large co-benefits if we protect the right places, and we can mitigate climate change and rebuild biodiversity at the same time. These are not conflicting agendas. These are agendas that are deeply intertwined and should be pursued together. At the same time, I do worry about the effects that climate change will have on these protected areas. I'm part of a larger project at the Ocean Frontier Institute where we're looking into how to manage protected areas under climate change. When the species that they're supposed to protect are shifting their distribution, when we see these changes in physical and biological parameters, and when half of, or almost half of the protected areas in this quadrant here, these are the protected areas we have now, will emerge from the SST envelope, meaning they will experience entirely novel temperature regimes within the next 20 years. And at the same time, these areas also have experienced low historical SST variability, meaning they're not in any way pre-adapted to large variations in temperature, but they're experiencing this particular rapid velocity of climate change, and they're not pre-adapted, so these could be good candidates for
disruptive effects of climate change on these protected areas. which some of which you can probably counter and account for through management, but then that management has to be climate adaptive. As Colette said in her introduction, we live in a changing time, and we have to account for this change and be on top of this change in order to be successful. And that's as true, or probably more true, in the ocean than it is anywhere else. Coming back to whales and the recovery of whales, we've been seeing in some of the negative effects we see where climate change occurs, such as the example for the North Atlantic right whales. Some of this can also be alleviated, or at least kept an eye on through smart use of technology. We're recently experimenting with VHR, or very high resolution satellite imagery. So these are satellite images with a meter or less resolution that are commercially available, and where now we can see individual whales. We can even make out species. We can also see large sharks, such as basking sharks. We can see leatherback sea turtles. A lot of these endangered species we can now track through satellite or other aerial sensors, and then we can train machine learning algorithms to detect these species and to automatically alert mariners and fishery managers, for example, that these whales are in the area, and implement dynamic management zones like we have for the North Atlantic right whale to keep those whales safe while they're in that area. So a new tool that is now very actively researched around the world to keep another eye from space in the ocean. And then the final point, and probably the most important point I want to make,
is we need to work with people. If we only think about fish and whales, we're missing the boat, because there's certainly more people than whales on this planet, maybe not more people than fish, but we certainly have an aggregate biomass that rivals the biomass of the fish we're harvesting. So we need to work with people, and we need to engage with people in order to make a change. It sounds very trivial, and it probably is, but I think we're only slowly starting to actually do that at scale. I've been thinking along these lines for about 10-15 years now, particularly interested in the concept of ocean literacy, which is defined as the understanding of the ocean's influence on you and your influence on the ocean. This really started in Canada in 2015 with a conference in Vancouver that was very influential for my career path, because it alerted me to the existence of a large constituency and also a lot of organizations and people in Canada that are working on this, working on ocean literacy, trying to inspire, engage, educate people around the importance of the ocean and their relationship with the ocean. I was also 5 years before that inspired by what I saw at the other end of the world in West Papua, Indonesia, where there was a large-scale education program that was going from village to village and teaching kids about their relationship to the ocean, actually enabling them to see the ocean for the first time by outfitting them with dive gear and giving them the tools to observe the ocean firsthand and to learn about the ocean firsthand. And that caused me to think about how we can do this at scale here in Canada, where most people live inland. And we started a project called Ocean School with the National Film Board, which since then has been deployed across schools in Canada and increasingly internationally. We'll use augmented and virtual reality to give people a real immersive experience, what it is like to be in the ocean, to ask their own question and engage in their own inquiry about what the ocean means to them. Ocean literacy also means to being aware of ocean culture. Here's a picture from, again, the Dalhousie First Nation where we filmed in British Columbia last year. And we really want to tap into people's creativity about the ocean. And I find it always so amazing and wonderful to work with kids, lots of kids who come up with these amazing ideas, for example, these comic strips they create, or these kind of quizzes they do about sharks wearing masks or not, that I could have never come up with myself. But when we tap into people's creativity, particularly young people, I think there's this huge potential to learn about the ocean, to come up with solutions. Ocean literacy in Canada is now strong and growing, particularly through the efforts of the Canadian Ocean Literacy Coalition. I really encourage you to check out their website. We've come up with a number of reports on the state of ocean literacy in Canada. Here's some of the organizations that are involved, as many others, of course. The one that I'm involved with is, again, Ocean School, and I want to show you a very quick trailer on what that's about and what that's like, so you can decide whether it's something you would like to engage with yourself.
Let's dive into Ocean School. Ocean School is a free online educational experience designed to help you better understand your impact on the ocean and the ocean's impact on you. Join our youth hosts as they work with inspiring scientists and experts to discover how each of us can help shape a healthy ocean. Ocean School is filled with great stories, told through immersive video and interactive experiences. Explore ecosystems and habitats, drive an underwater robot, or even dissect a virtual cod. Each piece of media is linked to a customizable activity designed to deepen learning. Are you a lifelong explorer? Just sign in and you're off to sea. Are you an educator? Start by discovering our content. Then visit the educator space, create your Ocean School class, and explore our help center. Built with inquiry in mind, Ocean School integrates with Google Classroom. Your students will navigate through the content, seeking information in order to put their learning into action. Whether you're an educator or a lifelong explorer, there's a lot to discover in Ocean School.
So that was just a quick overview of what it's about. And in COVID times, we just launched a new resource called Ocean School at Home, where you don't have to sign in. It's less meant for teachers, more meant for parents or students learning at home. You can visit the website oceanschool.ca/home and see for yourself. There's a lot of fun activities there. So it's meant for all ages. It's not just for kids, but it's geared mostly at kids from grades 5 to 10 to foster their learning and pick up some of the curriculum content they have to learn anyways at school and learn and teach that through an ocean lens. The very last point I want to make is that I think some of our efforts to engage youth and others in ocean literacy can come back to our efforts to better understand the ocean, to monitor the rapid change we're observing in the ocean by making science more inclusive. For example, through citizen science. Here's an example from a student of mine, Bethany Nordstrom, who enlisted people all across Nova Scotia to monitor jellyfish blooms. Other people have been crowdsourcing interested learners to, for example, analyze deep sea footage, interesting new partnerships that are emerging with aquaria, for example. The ocean shoreline cleanup is a wonderful citizen science example managed by Ocean Wise and Vancouver Aquarium. And then also partnerships with Indigenous people are becoming more and more common and important, particularly in this country, on all three coasts, I should say. And co-learning about different approaches to understanding the ocean, to researching it, and to managing it. And to that point, I couldn't resist but share with you a very quick trailer from the module that's coming out, I think, next month on the Dalhousie First Nation, again, in Ocean School. And just because it's close to home, a quick dive into the Central Coast, British Columbia.
The sea and the land feed one another in a forever cycle. This is rainforest country, Canada's Pacific Northwest, and home to the Heiltsuk Nation. My people have been stewards of this land and these waters for over 14,000 years. That's over 700 generations of Heiltsuk people. Our mission is to explore the central coast of British Columbia and the cycles that connect land and sea.
This rich ecosystem here depends on keystone species like herring and salmon that are important for the overall system to thrive. The Heiltsuk people and all of us depend on this vibrant environment in many different ways.
Yes, it's our highest catch yet.
Unfortunately, the harvest of both of these species and many others has been declining.
Everything we do on land ultimately is going to end up in the water.
Without those resources, a lot of the life as we know it today will be gone.
We'll count salmon as they battle to return to the place of their birth.
So if it was a bear, more of it would be eaten. And if it was a wolf, the brain would be probably missing.
We'll spot herring eggs from a seaplane, then take to the water and reel them in by the millions. And we'll dive deep into my people's balanced relationship with the natural world.
One of the most important aspects is to learn to incorporate multiple perspectives into understanding how this place has been changing and how we can do a better job in managing it.
We can talk about biomass levels, but that information in isolation isn't enough.
Whether animals, humans, we all have a role in the balance of an ecosystem like this.
It's really a merger of the local taste of knowledge and the actual science. We're natural scientists.
Learning these lessons of the past will be critical in leading us all towards a more sustainable future.
Everything that I learned, it's not for me, it's to pass on to the next generation. It's rooted in our DNA, it runs through our blood. It's who we are.
So, yeah, what can we do about it? I think at the first most fundamental level, we have to use both our brains and hearts to solve this problem. The end game, of course, still is to reduce our emissions, but also to amplify these win-win nature-based solutions I've been sketching out, to adapt our science and governance systems to become more dynamic with the changes that we see in our environment and our society, to really work together at this, not work in silos, not work in our ivory tower, and to really cultivate hope. Because if we don't have hope, we can turn this around. I don't think anyone will actually try. And lots of people want to try. A lot of these people are young, and to me, that's the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Boris. It was an incredible presentation as usual. We got some questions for you. The first one is from Adil Siddiqui, and he's asking to you, how do you think government will weight this restoration conservation regulation? Will be against policies like fishery subsidies, which enable unsustainable marine governance?
Yeah, so clearly subsidies are one of the major roadblocks we also identify in the paper. And I know people at UBC and elsewhere have been working for a long time to get rid of subsidies. There's some positive change in this field, but in Canada, I see it slow. And of course, the interests associated with these subsidies are very entrenched. So I think the only thing we can do there is to keep pointing out that money could be much better invested. And I think something that was innovative about the paper we did on rebuilding marine life was that we actually calculated the return on investment. If you were to invest in these nature-based solutions, the return on investment is about 10 to 1. For every dollar invested, $10 come out. Whereas with subsidies, oftentimes it's less than 1 to 1. For every dollar invested, less than $1 is earned. So it's clearly a better investment. I think based on that argument, maybe we can shift the needle a little bit further, but it's slow. I agree with that.
Hi, Boris. Whilst we wait for others to type in their questions, I have a question for yourself. I was going to ask you, thanks first of all for a really inspiring talk and for your connection to the ocean literacy component in particular. I think it's very inspiring. And like Deng Palomares said, she said, thank you, Boris, for that last video. It takes your message straight to the heart. And I really agree with that. So I was going to say, like, I think that, you know, in times of COVID, like you said, there's a real opportunity to really connect and bring some of these messages straight to the home. So I guess, how have you been developing some of these modules? Do you have communities that come to you and make suggestions, or do you have ideas and go to particular places or particular communities? Like, how do you develop these modules, basically?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a combination, but at the core, there's certain concepts we want to teach and we want to get across about the ocean. And we're looking for places that illustrate these concepts well. So the land-sea connection, for example, is very, very well documented for the Pacific Northwest. So we knew we wanted to touch on that there. But then with that idea, we actually went to the Hausa Nation without a clear idea of how exactly we're going to do this. We wanted them to tell us, and we wanted to really co-develop this module. And there was a long process, took over a year and a half, to just come up with the right questions to ask, the right species to study, the right example, the right people. So it's a very bottom-up approach. It starts with an idea for a concept we need to teach, to understand something very core and fundamental about the ocean, our relationship to it, and then we look for the best place to do this, and we let that place tell us how to do it.
Thanks for that.
A question from Rashid Samaila. Hope is good, but the world does not consist of just hope. We have despair too. Hope and despair motivate action differently. How do you balance the two?
Well, I gave a talk, this is 2 years ago now, to a group of, it wasn't a very large group, maybe 30 people, all very well educated, very knowledgeable people, adults. And I asked them to give me a word they associate with the ocean, just a word, right? And most of the words that came out were destruction, overfishing. There were words of despair and discouragement. And it so shocked me because the ocean, for me, the word that comes to me is love. That's my primary word for the ocean. And none of the words that came were positive. And so I think there's plenty of despair out there. And I agree, we first need to understand that there's a problem. Other than that, there's nothing that motivates us to search for solutions. But once we know there's a problem, I really think we need a hopeful vision to realize, to mobilize out of that despair and to move into direction. So I think the despair gives us consciousness, but the motivation to actually move is often comes from a sense of hope, a sense of we can do this, we can achieve something, there's something to be gained. I think that's a really important part. It's not just that we stem the loss, but there's actually something we can gain. And we can end up with a better world than the world we have today. And as I said, none of my students think that way, and I think that's tragic.
Thank you. Mimi Lam has another question for you, Boris. She says, thanks for a great talk. My question is, why have you focused in your talk on nature-based solutions as opposed also to human-based solutions? Yeah. Through ocean literacy, you effectively introduced examples of the latter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. So and we need both, absolutely, 100%, no question about it. And we probably need more human-based solutions because it's up to us what we will do. But what I meant with nature-based solutions, and thanks for helping me to clarify that, was solutions to climate change. So clearly emission reduction is the one thing we need to do that takes time. We're, I think, well underway. I just watched this year as the last offshore installations from the Sable gas field were dragged into Halifax Harbor to be dismantled and scrapped. There's no offshore development anymore in our region. This was totally different 10 years ago. It was like a gold rush, and now it's dead. And instead, I see wind turbines coming in from Denmark to be installed off Virginia, 350 million a pop. They install 150 of them over the next few years. So I see this huge shift in energy generation, but it takes time. It won't happen overnight. And at the same time, these nature-based solutions can help us achieve carbon neutrality faster and potentially even achieve negative emissions for some time, which we need to do in order to end up with ICP 2.6, which is where we need to be. But thanks for helping me clarify that.
And the last question from one of our students. I'm wondering what you think the characteristic of the most efficient oceanic school initiative has been and why?
The most efficient, sorry, what?
The most efficient, the characteristic of the most efficient ocean school initiative have been and why?
Most efficient, what we see, what really works well is activities that really engage people. So not just watching video. It's okay to watch a video as a trailer, as a teaser, something to get you interested, but then people need to do something hands-on. So we have a lot of very interactive activities where people can, for example, experiment with nutrient loads in fishing, where they can dissect the cod as shown in the one video. Things like this we find are really engaging. And then the ultimate is when we can bring it back to the person in your own life. So every module has a youth host, a young person who goes through the experience and kind of models the behavior and does the inquiry and so on. And at the end, he or she does a call for action where they bring it back to their own life. And even in my classes, I find the most effective and engaging thing you can do is do a personal change, do something that affects your own life. And this is, to me, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where we need to get. And it's also where people are most interested and most engaged. So I think we need a lot more of that. And we're only starting to do that. Thanks for the question, though.
Thank you so much, Boris. We have to wrap things up. So a very warm thank you. And I'll end on the words by one of the participants, Natasha Hardy, who said, "This was deeply moving. These are no trivial times, Dr. Boris Worm. I thank you for breathing so much hope and passionate action into our day and beyond." So thanks again very, very much.